This is the first video for Dr. Pritchard's lecture class in Anatomy and Physiology, the urinary system. In this lecture video, we will basically cover anatomy, some introduction to the urinary system, and basic anatomical components of the urinary system. So the urinary system is composed of some structures that most people are familiar with. We have the two kidneys, a right and a left kidney, the ureters, the urinary bladder, and the urethra. So in the process of urine formation, urine is formed by the kidneys. Urine flows down from each kidney, from down the ureter to the urinary bladder, fills the urinary bladder, and then releases trigger to the outside via the urethra. The responsibility of the urinary system is primarily to filter the blood and then return most of the water and most of the solutes to the bloodstream. So essentially what you're doing is filtering the blood, keeping what you need in the blood, and removing anything that is in excess. So if we look at a brief overview of the kidney functions, you find that there's a lot of these functions, but most of them are related back to that primary function, blood homeostasis, filtering the blood, making sure that all of the components of the blood are present in the correct levels. So as part of that, regulation of the blood ionic composition, so the amount of ions, sodium, potassium, calcium, chloride, phosphate ions, making sure all of those are in the correct concentrations within the blood plasma. Regulation of the blood pH through the hydrogen ions, regulation of the osmolarity of the blood. That's a measurement of the concentration of the blood itself. And regulation of the glucose levels. You will filter out lots of glucose by the kidneys, but all of that is going to be returned to the blood unless you have a problem with excessive blood glucose levels. Regulation of the blood volume. So just the sheer liters of blood that you have based on either conserving water if your blood volume levels are low or eliminating excess water if you have a high blood volume. Regulation of the blood pressure. The kidneys will be responsible for secreting an enzyme called renin. So that in this, the kidneys are going to act like their own endocrine organ. So they're going to release renin. Renin will travel through the bloodstream where it will cause the production of angiotensin, which is a very potent hormone. We went over it a little bit in the cardiovascular system and also in the endocrine system. And then angiotensin will cause the adrenal cortex to release aldosterone, which is another really important hormone for controlling blood pressure, and it controls blood pressure by coming back to the kidney and adjusting the amount of water retained in the kidney. Also, you can adjust blood pressure by adjusting what's known as renal resistance. So this is resistance to blood flow. It's going to have to do with vasoconstriction of arteries entering into the kidney itself. Release of erythropoietin. Erythropoietin is another hormone. Erythropoietin controls the production of red blood cells. Sometimes this is called EPO. And also calcitriol. So if your calcium levels are too low, calcitriol, one of the forms of vitamin D, will go eventually to your digestive tract and allow you to import enough calcium across your GI tract. And then finally, you see this down at the bottom of this list, and it's at the bottom of the list intentionally because this is really one of the lowest functions, although this is the function everybody automatically thinks of. Excretion of waste and foreign substances. Really, the kidneys are all about maintaining blood homeostasis. You do produce some waste, and those waste will circulate through the blood. So this is one area where you can get rid of those waste and any foreign substances. So if you take many drugs, they're going to be eliminated through the kidneys. But you'll notice this is at the bottom of the list, right? when you think of the kidney, you should think about controlling blood homeostasis, and there's a lot of things involved in that. All right, so I said we're going to do some basic anatomy, and we're going to talk about some internal anatomy of the kidneys, beginning with the parenchyma of the kidneys. Now, parenchyma really refers to the functional cells of any organ, as opposed to stroma, and stroma is spelled Stroma. Stroma is the connective tissue of organs that help hold the organ together. So the parenchyma is going to be the cells, the part of the kidney that's responsible, well, in the kidney, for manufacturing the urine, for filtering the blood and manufacturing the urine. So the parenchyma of the kidney can be divided into two main regions: the renal cortex, which is superficial, cortex is always superficial, and the renal medulla, the inner portion. Most of the renal medulla will be made out of some cone-shaped pyramids that we call the renal pyramids, separated by some renal columns. Now, the renal column is actually made out of the same type of material as the renal cortex, and we'll see a picture of this in a second. At the tip of each of the renal pyramids, they point down or towards the interior of the kidneys. At the tip of each of those is the renal papillae, right? That points towards the center of the kidney. That's where urine will drain out of the functional area of the kidney. Now, past that, we get into a drainage system. It fills the renal sinus cavity, a large opened area in the center of the kidney. Surrounding each renal papillae will be a very small cup-like structure called a minor calyces. A calyx, C-A-L-Y-X, that's singular, calyx means cup. So these are minor cups. They collect urine from the papillary ducts at the papillae, and then the minor calyces will fuse to form the major calyces, larger cups, and they empty into the renal pelvis, which is a central collecting area in the mid portion of the kidney, and that's going to empty directly down to the ureter. So here's a view of this internal anatomy. This is a frontal section of the kidney. All right, you can see the renal artery and vein entering into the kidney. If you look at the parenchymal area, you see the renal cortex. Right. Then just below that you see some pyramid or triangle shaped structures. Those are the renal pyramids. You see a little bit of the renal cortex material in between the pyramids. Those are called the renal columns. And then the minor calyces collecting from the tip of the renal pyramids fuse together form the major calyces. They all fuse together to form the renal pelvis. That empties urine into from the renal pelvis to the ureter and then on down to the urinary bladder. So if the kidneys are going to filter blood, they need a large blood supply. 25% of your resting cardiac output. Now, that's just resting cardiac output. When you become active, more blood is going to go to other areas like your large skeletal muscles. But when you're at rest, you are doing a very efficient job of filtering your blood. There's a lot of nerve supply. Mainly, as far as the autonomic nervous system, it's going to be the sympathetic nervous system, because the sympathetic nervous system will regulate blood flow. So sympathetic vasomotor nerves regulate the blood flow and renal resistance by altering the diameter of arterioles. So remember, arterioles are the last blood vessels with smooth muscle before we get into capillary beds. So we can regulate the diameter of these arterioles. Now let's take a look at this little picture that I have for you here. This is a picture of a single nephron, which is one functional or structural unit of a kidney, beginning with a glomerulus where blood is filtered, then going to a tubular system, right, and then exiting out of the nephron. Let's look at the arterioles and capillaries that are found here. First, we have an afferent arteriole, taking blood into a capillary bed called the glomerulus. But then here's something a little bit odd. coming out of this capillary bed, the glomerulus, we have an efferent arteriole, right? And that's because we are now going to send this blood to another set of capillary beds, the peritubular capillaries, or a capillary bed called the vasa recta. Right? And so your body will control filtration of the blood by controlling the diameter of the afferent and the efferent arteriole. All right, so let's look at these different capillary beds. The glomerular capillaries, that's where filtration occurs. The afferent and efferent arterioles will control movement of blood through the glomerulus. You can vasoconstrict those, you can vasodilate those. When you do that, you can produce large changes in the amount of filtration. If you shut down blood going to the if you shut down blood going to the glomerular capillaries, you shut down filtration. You shut down urine production. If you allow it to occur at the maximum level, then you're going to actually have a lot of filtration. You may accidentally get rid of too much water. So the body wants to control how fast that filtration occurs in the glomerulus. Then we have the peritubular capillaries. Peritubular capillaries are responsible for reabsorbing material that had been filtered out. So you will filter an incredible amount of material out of your plasma, but you're going to reabsorb the vast majority of that. And then we have the vasa recta. We will come back to the vasa recta towards the end of our lecture series on the kidneys, and that's because the vasa recta is a very unusual capillary system. It has the ability to supply nutrients to the medulla of the kidney, but without disrupting its osmolarity form. Right. All right, blood supply. There's a lot of blood supply to the kidneys. Now, I'm not going to go into a whole lot of detail or expect that much detail out of you in regards to this blood supply, but I want you to get the idea that the kidney is separated into these multiple components, all sort of wrapping themselves around each of these renal pyramids. Names that you should be familiar with include the renal artery going into the kidneys. And then I want you to be responsible for the structures immediately around the nephron. So you'll see these in black or outlined in black, the afferent arteriole, the glomerular capillaries, the efferent arterioles. You should also be familiar with the peritubular capillaries and the vasa recta. And of course, you should also be familiar with the renal vein, which exits out of the kidney. So let's look again at blood vessels that are found right around the nephron. Remember, the nephron is the functional unit of the kidney, made up of a renal corpuscle where you have the glomerulus and then a tubular system away from that. So we have our glomerular capillaries that are found in the renal corpuscle. This is where filtration occurs. The afferent arteriole goes into it. Coming out of the glomerular capsule, out of the glomerulus, is the efferent arteriole, and then the efferent arteriole will form the peritubular capillaries and the vasa recta. So the glomerulus is responsible for filtration. The peritubular capillaries and the vasa recta are responsible for tubular reabsorption, reabsorbing material from the fluid inside those nephrons back into the blood, and also responsible for tubular secretion, moving material from the blood into the tubular fluid. So if we look at one of these individual nephrons, the kidney has lots of them. They're composed mainly of a corpuscle and a tubular system. The renal corpuscle, that's where filtration occurs. You filter the blood plasma. The glomerulus, that's the capillaries that have filtration. Filtration occurs over or through a capsule. It's called the glomerular or Bowman's capsule. It's double-walled. One side is responsible for filtration. The other side forms a little cup that collects the filtered fluid. We call that the filtrate. Then, coming out of that, we have a system of a tube. It's called the renal tubule. There are three distinct portions of the renal tubule in a single nephron. The proximal convoluted tubule, it's proximal because it's closest to the renal corpuscle. It's convoluted because it's all twisty and turny. Then that moves into a loop of Henle that loops down into the medulla, down into the renal pyramid, and comes back up. And then it moves into the distal convoluted tubule. So this is up in the cortex again. It's far away from the renal corpuscle, and it's also twisty as well. Now, several distal convoluted tubules from different nephrons will fuse into a common collecting duct and papillary ducts, and those drain down to the renal pelvis, and to the calyces, the renal pelvis, and down to the ureters. Now, the collecting duct and the distal convoluted tubule, they act very similarly. So when we get to the physiology, I will be combining together the distal convoluted tubule and the collecting duct because they do the same things. All right, let's look at the structure of this renal corpuscle. All right. We have a afferent arteriole. You see the red line, the red arrow bringing blood in. It goes to the glomerulus, and then the efferent arteriole allows blood to exit. Let's look at the capsule that's associated with the glomerulus. We have, it's known as Bowman's capsule or the glomerular capsule. You have one layer that lays directly on top of the glomerular capillaries. The individual cells of those are called podocytes, and that's because somebody somewhere thought they looked a little bit like feet. I don't know, I don't really see it. That's the visceral layer. It lays directly on top of the capillaries, and then far away from that we have a layer of simple squamous epithelia. So that's the parietal layer, and that's the collecting layer, and it's going to then move that filtrate into the first of the tubular system, the proximal convoluted tubule. All right, now let's look back at the afferent arteriole, the glomerulus, and the efferent arteriole, and I want to point out just quickly that the afferent arteriole usually has a larger diameter than the efferent. This is going to allow for some pretty high blood pressure to build up in the glomerulus as lots of blood enters but less blood exits. All right, now let's look at a structure that we find right alongside of the glomerulus. It's called the juxtaglomerular apparatus. What does that mean? Juxta, next to, glomerulus, next to the glomerulus. All right. So this is a little structure that you see where the afferent arteriole leading into the glomerulus makes contact with the ascending limb of the loop of Henle. So the loop of Henle dips down into the renal medulla and then comes back up. So where it comes back up is the ascending limb, and it's actually that turn area where it goes from loop of Henle to distal convoluted tubule. In fact, you'll see some textbooks will actually say this structure is with the distal convoluted tubule. So it's right at that junction point. So there's two different structures that make up this juxtaglomerular apparatus. The first is the macula densa. So locate the macula densa on the picture on this screen. You'll see that it's where you have lots of cells that are kind of tightly packed together. So it's a tight spot, which actually exactly is what macula densa means, a dense spot. There's a lot of cells tightly clustered together. These are actually sensory cells. They are going to monitor the fluid going through the tubule. Now, if this is at the ascending limb of the loop of Henle or the distal convoluted tubule, this is pretty far along in the production of urine by the kidney. So it would be a good feedback area to sense the product being formed. And if there's something wrong with that, you may want to change what you're doing at the very beginning. And the very beginning step is going to be here in this glomerulus. So the macula densa is that sensory structure, and it's right next to some cells called juxtaglomerular cells. So these are some extra smooth muscle cells that are found around the afferent arteriole. And what they're going to be able to do is they could constrict, and that's going to slow down blood flow into the glomerulus. If you slow down blood flow to the glomerulus, you begin to reduce filtration. When you reduce filtration, you slow it down, you allow for more modification to occur. Or you could let this thing run wide open. You could just let those juxtaglomerular cells, those smooth muscle cells, completely relax and have really fast blood flow going into the glomerulus. So filtration will be really fast, and the flow of urine through the tubular system will also be really fast. So you can do a lot of adjustments. If you slow down the movement of the fluid, then you're going to reabsorb more material. If you speed it up, you reabsorb less. Now, the main thing you reabsorb is water. So this is going to do a good job controlling how much water eventually gets reabsorbed. Number of nephrons, constant from birth, but you increase the size. So the nephrons are made of multiple cells, so you increase the number of cells in a nephron, it can get larger. Unfortunately, if you injure a nephron, if it dies, you don't replace the nephron, but there's incredible redundancy in the urinary system. In fact, you don't see dysfunction until all the functions decline by 25% of their normal. Okay, so if that begins to occur, the other nephrons can handle the extra work. There's enough redundancy of nephrons. And if you remove one kidney, which is often done in kidney donation, it will cause the other kidney to begin to enlarge until the point where it can filter at 80% of the normal rate of two kidneys. And remember, you don't see dysfunction until it declines by 25%, until you're at 75% of the normal. Then you may be able to detect just the beginnings of dysfunction. So one kidney could handle the load of two kidneys. All right, so I'm going to just mention the main processes of renal physiology, and this is where we're going to pick up next in our overview of the urinary system. So the nephrons and collecting ducts are going to have, well, there's one main process. It's called excretion. You want to get rid of anything that's in excess, so that's going to be excreted. But the processes where you get to excretion include glomerular filtration, filtering the blood plasma, tubular reabsorption, reabsorbing water and other things that you need, and tubular secretion, where you, in the tubules, will move things from the blood into the urine. And this is where we're going to be picking up next time.